Good morning, everybody. I hope you had a wonderful evening yesterday with this performance by Kat from the National Film Board, and followed by this fantastic panel of as Roger said, what did you call them? The rock stars, yes, the panel with the rock stars, and that you got a good night's sleep. And I welcome you all back here at York University bright and early on a Saturday, beautiful Saturday morning, and we will talk about land today, and I hope that in the afternoon you can actually explore a little bit the land, wherever you find it. We have two distinguished speakers this morning, and it's my great pleasure that we were able to have Richard Harris from around the corner from Hamilton here on as one of the keynote speakers, but also Anne Haila from Finland, who came all the way to give her perspective on land and property. The first speaker is going to be Richard Harris. As an urban geographer, he became interested in history, and he looks at the built environment as a prism on which he studies social, cultural, and economic changes. In particular, he looks at the residential development. On the one hand, is one of his areas of studies. The other one is housing policies in British colonies from 1929 to independence. He's well known as within the suburban community, for academic community, because he has published some foundational works, starting with his work on unplanned suburbs, Toronto's American Tragedy, 1900 to 1950, followed by Creeping Conformity, How Canada Became Suburban, same time period, and his most recent book, Building a Market, The Rise of the Home Improvement Industry, 1980 to 1960. He's also a Fellow of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, as well as a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. We are also in the process of putting together a book on land that we are in the process of working, and so this might be a first snippet on this question of what is land. Richard.
Thank you, Ute. Ute mentioned that this afternoon you guys might explore the suburbs. I've already done that this morning in a way that I had not intended. I was coming from Hamilton, driving, unfortunately, but sometimes I take the bus. But planning to take the 407, which is the quickest route, the highway. They've closed it today, so I had to come a different route. And the different route took me to Keele Street on the south side of campus. And what did you know, but they've closed part of Keele Street too. So I've seen bits and pieces that I had not intended to. I'm always intrigued by the audience psychology. I was up here earlier and I noticed the first two people who came into the auditorium, you were one, front and center. I don't know whether that's intimidating or what. And the other was you right at the back in the corner. I'm not quite sure what this means.
Sprawl.
Sprawl, yes, that's about it. So I hope I have these the right things. When I started to think about what I could talk about today, I sort of started out with a list about that long, and then I thought, no, there's not very much time. And I really want to focus on, what's the key message? And it took me a while to figure it out. And then when I'd figured it out, I thought, well, this is pretty obvious, isn't it? So, sorry if I'm stating the obvious, but it seems to me that the very basic thing, if we're talking about at least suburbanization and suburban development, is money, and the role that it plays in the whole process. the various channels and networks through which it moves. Now, for the purposes of this presentation, at any rate, it seems to me we can distinguish between two obviously closely related, interrelated issues. First, what of course the conference and the project of which this is in a sense a part talks about as suburbanism. Suburbanism in existing areas. Obviously, cultural aspects of suburbanism, the way of life question mark, is there such a thing as the suburban way of life? Social aspects, the diversity, the ethnic and class diversity, which is a big theme in the recent literature, and issues of government and governance of existing areas. On the one hand, that's one sort of category of issues. And then there's the issue, or the category, as to how those spaces came into existence, the process of suburban development and land conversion, which of course involves taking very different forms in different places, issues of planning and regulation, infrastructure provision, and also of just physically of land conversion, the development process. And what strikes me, and over the past 4 years I've read more than I had ever imagined was in existence about both suburbanism and suburban development globally. And the thing that strikes me is that the first category, the suburbanisms, particularly in North America, have been relatively well documented. Of course, there's lots of areas, black holes, but there's an awful lot, it seems to me, written about the cultural, especially, and social aspects, also government of suburban areas. Not so much, I think, about suburban development, and in particular, the last element there, if this works. Well, never mind. The land conversion aspect. And that's really what I want to focus on today. And what I want to try to convince you of is that it is not only important, but also a dramatic story. Now, it's dramatic in a physical sense, in terms of the landscape that's transformed very visibly. But it's also dramatic behind the scenes, dramatic in terms of the wrangling, the political battles, and struggles between the private sector and government as to what form development takes, and also, in particular, who profits. Now, in a North American context, there have been a number of very influential and very good studies which have looked at some aspects, certainly, of this land conversion process. There's the classic study, of course, by Sam Bass Warner, Boston's suburbs in the late 19th century. And skipping close to the present, I think, a very fine study is Witold Rybczynski's, if I get the pronunciation correct, a study of New Daleville, a new urbanist suburb, presented in a very different style, a much more accessible style in some ways, obviously for a more general audience, but really following through the process of development in a way that's very rarely done, I think, even in North America. Now, we think we know, I have this feeling that we think we know a lot, even in North America, about how land development works. Many of you, perhaps all of you, have seen such types of images of Levittown, and we think we know how Levittown developed, and of course Levittown is often taken as being the emblematic form of suburban development, post-war suburban development in North America. I would suggest that there's an awful lot more, even on this continent, to be said about the process in places such as my hometown, the fringe of my hometown, recent suburban development there. But especially when we move beyond North America, there's, I think, an awful lot to be said that has not been said about how suburban development happens. So here we have an area of what's sometimes known as replanning, in Shanghai. And you can see that it is, if you look at the top portion of that pair of photographs, it is in fact exactly the same area at two different points in time, 6 years apart. But the middle portion has been completely replanned. So obviously they demolished existing structures and they replanned the street layout. Well, there's, visibly, certainly, a very dramatic example of suburban development and redevelopment. I'd also suggest that behind the scenes there must be a lot of drama there too, which I think typically we don't know much about. Here's an example from Mexico City. I won't try to pronounce it. Someone in the audience might be able to help me with that. Can anyone tell me how I should be pronouncing that? Sorry? Stapoluca? Okay. I'm cheating. The reason I put this particular example up, same 6-year period as for Shanghai, is because I'd recently come across this amazing image, which is actually a photograph of that exact area. And I've suggested there's drama. One thing you might notice, bottom right-hand corner there, well, not quite in the corner, but on the right-hand side towards the bottom, there's a wall. What's that about? I don't know. But again, I'm trying to emphasize drama. And drama, too, a very different kind of development. And I know that over the course of the conference you've been hearing about and talking about very different types of suburban development with the underlying question, what do they have in common? And there are commonalities, but there's obviously huge differences. Prem Nagar, suburban Mumbai. This is how it looked from the air from a satellite in October 2000. The slum area that you see to the right, there's a green space to the left, which is actually mostly water. And there you can see how it evolved physically over a period of time as it expanded. And you may also notice the appearance in the top left-hand corner of a very different type of development. In fact, it's a suburban mall. And then it contracted involuntarily in November of 2012 as that site was cleared. So there was slum clearance and not much, I don't think, resettlement. Now that's an obvious example of drama again, both physically and also, it hit the news, it was dramatic. We do hear something about that, but the underlying process of development, I think, is often hidden and nonetheless dramatic. So what's the plot here? The plot, as I've already suggested right at the beginning, is, or if you want to understand the plot, we follow the money. Who owns the land? Who finances and profits from that land? Who profits from the development of that land? And what rules govern that process? The process of the land market, which is pretty well ubiquitous, and that is a commonality everywhere. Whether it be Prem Nagar or whether it be Shanghai in a different form, or whether it be North America. We're talking about market processes with different rules. Who sets those rules? These, it seems to me, are important key questions. There's two types of sources of profit involved in this. There's the profit from simply the conversion of land from rural, usually rural, to urban use. Now I've said, underlined, higher rate of profit. And by that I mean the value of land goes up 4-fold or 10-fold or 20-fold as it goes from rural use to urban use, depending on the context. So there's a huge rate of profit there for whoever happens to be holding onto that land and is able to realize that development gain. So that goes to owners maybe, it goes to speculators perhaps, and it might go to the state depending on circumstances, which I'll get to in a minute. And then there's a source of profit which comes from the actual development of that land, and that is more costly. It costs more to develop land, to provide the infrastructure and the buildings and so on and so forth. And some of that, of course, goes to developers and builders. Some of that, again, may go to the state, again, depending on circumstances. But here, lenders often play a very large role. Lenders, which is another way of saying investors, and they may be local, but depending on the context, many times not local. So then we're talking about flows of capital over distances, maybe international. What are the types of agents? Well, to categorize them simply, private sector, obviously, landowners, developers, builders, and so forth. Public agents too, usually local government or some form of municipal government, realizing income from the development process through maybe real estate taxes. Property tax, of course, is a familiar one in many contexts. Land transfer taxes, the stamp tax, for example, in India, where when property is transacted, there's a tax on that transaction. Or development rights, the appropriation of that value, that increase in the value from rural to urban, through some type of betterment levy, or there's different terms that are used, but sometimes states do, or at least try to gain some of that value increase in the rent. How are the spoils of that process divided up? Well, it varies enormously. In North America, mostly, probably, in most contexts, it's private agents that realize the gains. In some contexts, England in the late 1940s, under a Labour government, tried to bring in a really comprehensive betterment levy so that any gains from the conversion from rural to urban would go to the state. And that lasted sort of for a while and then changed and evolved, and a lot of that was lost. Very commonly, of course, there's some type of compromise. And an example here is the Ontario Greenbelt, where the government, provincial government, as many of you will be aware of Ontario, imposed a green belt, or defined a green belt around Toronto and also around Hamilton, and didn't compensate landowners for the fact that this land was at least supposedly going to remain under rural use. So there's an instance where there was some sort of a compromise. Obviously, there's always a political struggle about this. That, I think, is fairly obvious. The nature of the political struggle, however, varies enormously according to the cultural assumptions that are embodied typically in law, in the market rules, or the rules of the market locally. The big issue, of course, is to what extent do private landowners have the right to any betterment gain and profit, as opposed to the rights of some sort of public agency, the state typically, to appropriate that development gain. The struggles are obviously most intense where the stakes are highest, and that can be where the regulation is very tight. And tight regulation leads to high rents, high land values. The struggles are also most intense where in regions which have experienced high rates of growth, and there you might find rapid price inflation, and extensive areas. By areas, I mean geographical areas for profit. So contrast London and Shanghai in the 1990s, for example. This is a pair of images taken from a recent publication looking at urban growth worldwide. Obviously, you know it. There you can see it. Shanghai has been growing much more rapidly. The process of land conversion from rural to urban has been much more extensive, and the amounts of gain in one form or another to be realized in Shanghai has obviously been correspondingly greater. But one thing that I want to underline is it's easy in very generalized presentations to present a kind of a seamless thing and suggest, well, this is the main story. But the main story has infinite local variations, some of which are unpredictable. Very recently, there was published a book on the suburbanization of Bombay, as it was then, in the first half of the 20th century by Nikhil Rao. And one of the things that he talks about is, obviously, in that period of time, certainly in the teens and the 20s, I mean, this is a colonial state, authoritarian in one sense, of course. ownership of land in Bombay was for the most part private, and for the most part indigenous. I mean, it was Indians, not the Brits. And so you might expect, oh, well, in that sort of a situation when, as happened from the 1900s onwards, actually, the state decided to promote redevelopment of the city and also to replan, in the same way that I showed you for Shanghai, to replan some of the suburbs. You might think, well, it would just come in and do it. Well, but then when it tried to do that, it ran into a lot of problems. It was taken to court, and in fact, the courts upheld the rights of private ownership, even though the private ownership was indigenous, and even though that went against the desires and the interests of the colonial state at that point. A political struggle, but the outcome of that struggle was not entirely predictable. The outcome of those sorts of struggles affect who will then drive the process of suburbanization. In certain contexts, the state is the entrepreneur. China today, I think, is a good example. More commonly, it's developers, those investors that I talked about before, and therefore, to some extent, global capital as the drivers of the process. Both can be problematic unless restrained. The question, obviously, is how. I'm not going to answer that question. I'm not even going to try. What I will do is to leave you with some questions that I think we as researchers should be thinking about. I think that we should be paying more attention to who owns land, to who invests and profits, to the rules of the market, which are infinitely variable. We, I think, all should know by now that there isn't this standard thing, the market. Markets vary, just as suburbs vary in character. And who then has the incentive to drive that process? Who's pushing it? Who has the incentive to push that along? Thanks.
Thank you, Richard. Our next speaker is Anne Haila from the University of Helsinki, and her expertise has been over the last few decades on property rights, land, the question of land in various contexts. She also studied mega projects. Her areas of research took her from Helsinki, her hometown, I assume, maybe not, but Finland, to Singapore, Hong Kong, China, via Los Angeles. And she was a visiting scholar in the early 1990s at UCLA at a time when a lot of interesting things happened in Los Angeles. And her publication record is a reflection of her engagement in these global networks. She has published widely on Singapore, on China, and on Finland under these research questions that she poses. In particular, her most, over the last few years, she has been at the forefront to influence the debate on China. Among many articles is one in particular, The Market as the New Emperor. She also has, over the last 10 years, been instrumental in redrawing the orientation of the research policy for the European Science Foundation through their Urban Science Forward Look. And she has been part of a European-wide research network. Anne, thank you.
So good morning, everybody. And first of all, thank you for Ute and Roger and everybody who invited me. This is really a great opportunity. This Suburbanism conference seems to be really, as Alan Mabin said yesterday, it's a really interesting project. So I was asked to do two things. First, to give a theoretical framework and to talk about Asia. And the first one, the theoretical framework, is no problem because I have right away in my mind what I'm going to talk about land rent theory, because I have been obsessed that for decades. But the second demand was a little more challenging, because the cities I know best in Asia are Singapore and Hong Kong. And what is suburban in Singapore and Hong Kong is quite ambiguous. And also, I come from Northern Europe, and as Ute and Richard Harris and Bloch says in the discussion paper, that this concept of suburban is a cultural dependent. So in Finland, we don't use that so much, because we have a strong position of autonomous position of municipalities guaranteed by the constitution. And so it's, I hope this talk will, I have examples of Singapore and Hong Kong that are dense and high-rise, will give some other alternative perspective to this project. And so far the papers I have heard here, I would perhaps describe them suburban as an empirical object. So I'm trying to present a theoretical argument here, and so I hope I managed to do that. So first of all, if I think of what is suburb and the suburban question, I definitely see that as a land question. And I've been talking with Solomon Benjamin, why there are so few papers on land in this conference, because basically I see the suburban question as a land question. And if I look at the literature, and usually in the research on land question, my background is economics, so economists are not interested in land and real estate. And those studies you find interested in land and real estate or land, it's in informal contexts. So I'm going to talk about two developed city-states, Singapore and Hong Kong. It's not an informal issue at all, but it's really relevant, the land issue, also in organized modern societies. It's not only this kind of informal. So I don't know, have everybody read this discussion paper written by Richard Harris, Ute Lehrer, and Robin Bloch, the suburban land question? Ute gives some reference that there is going to be a book on land to be published, and I was very interested of this discussion paper, and I read there was a definition of suburban. So there was a reservation that the concept of suburban is a cultural dependent, so different countries and cultures understand that differently. But the definition I find of suburban is that all areas that are or have recently been at or near the expanding urban fringe. However, I couldn't find any definition what is urban fringe, and I think that's quite, I don't quite understand what is urban fringe. Perhaps it's my European background again. And so this paper also made a point, why is it possible to compare suburbs around the world? And I think these two reasons I find in this paper were quite interesting. So the first argument was that between this suburbanization in different countries, there's a difference of degree. And there was a reference that also in the developed Western world, the suburbanization is informal. And I was reading a kind of influence of this, you can say perhaps popular global South paradigm in this discussion paper, emphasis of informal. Again, I'm going to talk about very formal structure, and I think land issue is also really important in this kind of formal development, strong state context. And also the second argument for the comparability of these suburbanism around the world was that in the developed West, previously the development was like today in developing countries, and if it's possible to compare past and present, it's also possible to compare present. And I find this quite interesting argument. So what I'm going to do in my presentation, I'm going to apply or use the theory of land rent, and applied to the Asian urban question. And instead of this word urban fringe that was used in this discussion paper, I'm going to talk about use the word margin. And this is also in the title of my paper. And with this, I refer to the change of land use and focusing on the process. I think this previous presentation was in a way calling the focus on or study on the development process. And with this concept of margin, I will explain later, I particularly want to focus on this development process, when land use is changing and why. And I'm going to introduce a lot of urban rent concepts. I hope you tolerate that, and present what I have formulated historical land regimes. And through these, I locate suburbanization. Again, my approach to suburbanization is it's much more trivial than in this project and not so sophisticated. And so with this theoretical framework, I asked two questions with these two empirical examples. Why lands in the new territories in Hong Kong were not developed? And the second question, how Singapore, that is without hinterland, grows. And so both of these, Hong Kong may be less, but Singapore definitely is a strong developmental state. And so I'm looking for the land question, not in an informal sense, but what the state is doing, strong developmental state. So why the theory of land rent? And now, when I'm using the word rent, I'm usually put the beginning land rent because I'm using that in the classical economic sense, not in the sense of rent seeking. That has nothing to do with the land. So when I talk about rent, I mean land rent and some surplus profit or revenue connected to land. So why theory of land rent and how do I apply that is because I see land rent as a social relation. It's in a way makes possible to look power relations in land, control of land, social relations on land, and also because land rent, the profit or revenue really affects to the profit of developers, price, housing prices, and it has two types of effects, deduction of the profit of developers, but then also this effect on through the land ownership and power social relations. And so why land rent theory is useful, it's because of these three aspects in land or urban development process. First, the use value, for example, the built environment. It affects the built environment. Exchange value, profit or revenue. Singapore and Hong Kong are very good examples of public revenue coming from the land. For Hong Kong, some years when the property market is booming, something like 40% of the revenue of the government is coming from the land. And like in Finnish municipalities, it's less than 5%. So it's a big difference. And then the third aspect is asset value. Makes possible to look for the speculation. And today, of course, securitization of land. So I briefly defined this urban land rent concept. So originally, theory of land rent was developed in the context of agriculture, and I refer to David Ricardo at the beginning of 19th century. And so he defined differential rent. So land in suburbs and city urban areas, they are of different qualities. So for example, location is the most simple example of differential rent, what I call extension rent, when the land use is extended, maybe to the suburbs, beyond the city limits. And so in rent theory, already in the original form in Ricardo, but not exactly developed, was this concept of extensive margin, because this Ricardian rent theory was in a way calculated based on the last piece of land that is productive, making connection to the market price. So extensive margin is the last piece of land that has been taken into use. So then I defined the second type of differential rent, density rent. that is coming from the increasing the plot ratio, increasing the density, building high. And this is now what I'm interested in. Why Singapore and Hong Kong are building high, increasing the density, although there is a land, especially in Hong Kong. Then I also use absolute rent. Many rent scholars are abandoning the concept of absolute rent, but I find it useful because land hoarding and speculation, land banking, really affects what happens in the built environment. Monopoly rent is connected to excess demand, so better quality houses, why the prices are high. Fiscal rent, I connect to this public revenue coming from land. As I mentioned, Hong Kong, 40% could be from the land sales. Global rent, again, especially what has happened because of the euro and subprime crisis in Asian cities, this hot money went to Asia. And like in 1 year, 90% of the housing prices increased in Singapore because of this hot money. And so I find it useful to separate this kind of global portion and the increase of the housing and real estate prices. Then the next concept, derivative rent, I define this title of land packed together with the mortgages and speculated on the financial market. And this, again, really has a tremendous impact what is happening to the urban landscape and property sector. And then I also use the potential rent and actual rent and the concept of rent gap. And here comes this concept of margin of transference when the land use is changed. So I see the rent gap interpreted as an incentive for the owner to change the use of land. The point of these different rent concepts is not to encourage you to calculate the portions of different rents in the land price or value of land, but to focus that this mechanism of this value increase are different, and therefore the policies to affect these excessive prices, for example, is different. That's why I find it useful to separate these concepts. The second distinction I make is the 5 mobilization of land. First, horizontal, extending land use subdivision, and here I put my suburbanization. Maybe this is very trivial for you, but I see suburbanization, this horizontal extension of land use. Then vertical, intensifying higher, increasing plot ratio, so Singapore and Hong Kong. Redevelopment, so that demolishing and building new. And global, so I want to look for the forces affecting the land development process. So global as an external forces, like I told the example, just is an example. Then 5th, valorization, and here I disconnect to this financialization of land becoming an asset, speculated in the financial market and securitization. And based on these 2 theoretical framework, rent theory and mobilization of land, I would like to introduce these historical land regimes. So I identify 4 different historical land regimes: indigenous, feudal, capitalism, and financialization, and with different dimensions in these. First, land treated as, so what is the time or form of land? What is the form of property? What are the relations, social relations around land? What is the justification? Again, land and tenure ownership always needs justification, and urban scholars don't pay enough attention to that. There's always the others who believe your title and claim. And then the type of rent, and then development modes. And how much do I have time? 5 more minutes. Okay, I go briefly through. First, let's begin with this indigenous, because I was very surprised there is no papers of indigenous land in Canadian conference, because I thought it must be relevant topic, because I have read some First Nation people said it's crazy to think that you can own the land. It's like owning a cloud, And so the land is treated as a nature, and the former property is customary or shared or common. Relation is man and nature, and justification is use. And there's no rent relation. And, well, this sustainable should be in citations, like one Indian tribe believed that buffaloes live under the earth, and if you make certain rituals, there's an abundance of buffaloes. But I just want to make the criticism against this, the tragedy of the commons that is assumed against this common or shared or customary land use. Then the feudal land regime is the next social relation, leased land, landlord and tenant relation, and the power relation, and feudal rent. And what I refer with this municipal land for public good, it's a European history, because at that point of time, municipalities in Europe started to accumulate the land that they used for the public benefit. And I find, again, I think majority of the conference people come from the common law countries, but I come from the Roman law country with some French scholars here, but I see very much parallels with this feudal type, with this land lease system in Singapore and Hong Kong, and also this ancient system in China. And so, again, I find this is an interesting area to explore. And then the next type, capitalist land, becomes a commodity, treated as a thing. And then what is important about these relationships, the relations between the production and the built environment. And again, I think urban scholars get confused when they talk about the production and when they talk about land development process. It's a different thing. And then market is a justification, and there's a list of all these concepts, different absolute monopoly. And here, again, I put this uncontrolled development and suburbs, but also gated communities. So what type of development this uncontrolled capitalistic commodity type of development produce? And then this last regime, financialization, land is an asset, investment object. What is important is a real estate investment and other financial instruments, and speculation, not only land speculation, but bets in the fine markets. And as I explained, this derivated rent, and then the mode of development, corporatization, and selling of municipal land, all these neoliberal forms of land policy. So with this framework, I want to ask, why some cities grow horizontally, some others grow vertically, and some others recycle land? For example, in the socialist system, there was no recycling of land. Why Singapore and Hong Kong grow high and increase density? And as an Asian urban question, I define the Solvino question of masses and density. So what is very strange thing for even in China, maybe the Chinese scholars can answer this, why even in China, where there's plenty of land, the houses are high. Like today in Singapore and in Hong Kong, the houses are 60 stories high. In my Helsinki, there's a 6-story limit, so there's a really big difference. So I have briefly these two examples. So Hong Kong. On the left side, you have a map of Hong Kong. So on the top, you see the China already. But on the purple is urban land, urban developed land. And the green areas is unbuilt, undeveloped land. So you see Hong Kong Island, and most of these green areas are in the new territory. So Hong Kong is one of the most densely, I think it's really the most densely populated city in the world, but 26% of the land is developed. And most of this urban land is on reclaimed land. So why is that? And so after explanations why particularly new territories became not developed was because it was a leased land in the end of the 19th century from China, so that was an uncertainty and the closeness to the China border. But there is also Another interesting reason, if you look the land ownership in the new territories, there is this lineage corporate land ownership. That is the ancient Chinese ownership type that the British colonialism wanted to protect for interesting reasons. And their deeds were oral, not always written deeds, and then this ownership is scattered by these clan members around the world. So it's really difficult for the developers to assemble land, and also for the government. So obviously, if this is suburban or sprawl or whatever, the land is important factor and issue here. And the second example is Singapore. So the current population of Singapore now, there is not abundance of land, so there is a scarcity of land. And the current population is 5.3 million, but the most recent white paper population is estimated that it will be 6.9 million. So where to put these extra people? And so the government owns 90% of the land. It has developed this land bank through powerful land acquisition laws, or the eminent domain, and it gives lands for 99-year leases, never sells the land like my city Helsinki. And as I said, this is the common law system. After the lease, the land comes back to the government, and the torrent system that has adopted from Australia, that means central register by the state, not by the deeds. And how to solve this problem, where to put these people? And I think that there are two laws. So now we're talking about the powerful developmental state, and I find very interesting. Now begins the second round of land acquisitions. So when Singapore developed this huge 90% land bank, there was the original land acquisitions. But that's in a way not enough. Now goes a new round, and I have made a conclusion that in urban areas you really need to have that, this kind of continual land acquisitions. That's in a way the nature of urban land. And the second quite new legislation is what is called en bloc collective sales, and this concerns condominiums. Maybe Ute, condominium queen, might be interested on this, and I think this is also going to be a big issue in Finland, where we have the big issue, the most common type of development is condominiums. So 1999 there was passed a law that if 80% of the occupants in the condominium agree to sell the house, then it goes to the market. Or if the house is less than 10 years old, 90% majority. And of course, if the 10 or 20% disagrees, they can appeal to the court, but then it can be redeveloped. And there has been completely new houses that has been knocked down and built even higher. And I think it's an interesting legislation because it, in a way, incites people to collective behavior, but also makes them Singaporeans property investors, and they really make this money through this. I think this was my last slide. Yes.
Thank you very much, Richard and Anne. The floor is open for questions. We have a few minutes time to elaborate more further the question of land. What is it? And how is it produced? How is it exchanged? What are the problems? Please raise your hands. Questions. Is this Michael? Oh, there's...
Okay, well, thank you to both speakers for really illuminating and challenging papers. And Richard, I was very pleased that you showed that image of Sam Bass Warner's Streetcar Suburbs, because so much of this conference ultimately comes out of that book. And I would just raise the issue for both speakers that Warner did, that For him, of course, the key issue was access and transportation. That land does not become developable without access. So that the key move in this whole development game becomes that of whatever large institution is providing or not providing transportation access, and where they choose to do it, and if they are doing it as with the streetcar companies, as both as often both developers as well as transportation companies. So I just kind of challenge both of you to sort of include that in your already quite complex system of thinking about land.
Want to respond to it, or yeah?
I think that's a great question, because if I think of Hong Kong, in both cities, Singapore and Hong Kong, there's a marvelous subway system, and you can go everywhere in the city. And also Hong Kong subway is, I have understood, it's the only public transportation system that doesn't need any subsidies. And the secret is that when they developed subway station, the government is getting the development rights and betterment levy, or whatever you call it. And again, it's hilarious to compare the situation in Helsinki. There's one subway line, but it's developed in the order that first the lands are sold to the private owners, and then the subway line is developed, and then the government is confiscating the land with a high price. So I think that's an important point.
I can only agree, Bob. I mean, it's obviously infrastructure is one larger category, and that's a big component in that. And obviously the projects of which this conference is a part. One of the main themes of that is that, but it's true. I mean, I didn't touch on that, but it's key, certainly to the conversion from rural to urban and what type of urban it becomes.
Thank you. Further questions? Michael had his hand up. Others?
Good morning. I'm really honored to be following Professor Fishman's question, because I see an elegant complementary presentation from particularly Professor Harris with Professor Fishman's fish note in keynote, I mean. And the key thing that I take out of your presentation is the transfer of wealth, that you have the state as an actor that's benefiting, you have the private sector that's benefiting, but you also have transfer of wealth from state to private sector, and you have it in some cases vice versa as well, which brings it a very social and political aspect to this land regime. And I'd like to hear your insights on how the social and political aspects are influenced. Thank you.
Oh, that's a nice little question. My answer is going to be really to repeat, or maybe at most elaborate on what that one slide that I showed of Bombay, because absolutely, of course, there's transfers of money, of profit, which Anne, I think, dealt with in a more systematic way, the types, the forms that happens in. But the way it happens, the direction, the magnitude, just the whole way that it happens is very locally specific. I think it's very difficult to generalize about that. And you can develop expectations based on very broad categories. But when it comes down to it, a lot of it depends on the outcome of local circumstances, from physical circumstances to social and political, to struggles. I mean, to battles, because I mean this is inherently. I mean, I guess maybe I didn't even emphasize it enough. The whole process is inherently political. It is never. I mean, it may be relatively smooth in certain contexts, but certainly there's politics that's implied in it. All I'm saying is the outcome of that politics is unpredictable.
Well, I would like to answer that question by referring to the example of Singapore, because Singapore is a really, no matter what you think about it politically, the housing system is really brilliant and excellent. So 87% of population live in public housing and 90% are homeowners. So it means that this transfer of wealth, it goes to the housing sector. But at the same time, one of the largest developers in Asia, like Capital Land, that are making huge profits, and some other developers also, they make good money, but it's this separation of these markets and no speculation of land in the housing and public housing sector. And I think that is in a way key. Of course, this is a long issue, this public housing, but I think it's a good example of the good social effects of the very good and tight land policy and no speculation and government ownership of the land.
Thank you. One more question. We have time for one more question. Yeah.
Thank you. Those were very interesting presentations. And my question, I guess for both of you really, is the question of demand, the people who are going to occupy the houses that are built, people who are going to use the commercial spaces that get developed and so on. How do you fit that into your views of this development process and the following the money and the rent and so on?
So you mean occupation by whom?
Houses that get built aren't always occupied because for various reasons they are built without an effective demand for it. Obviously there's demand for housing, but the way that they get built do not allow for the occupation to always
what you're talking about, sorry to jump in, I mean you're talking about speculative development, I mean speculative construction. And I mean that can be certainly a cyclical element. You know, it's the boom and bust cycle which real estate everywhere goes through. But I'm not sure how that relates to, because your original question I think was just, well, what about demand? Where's it coming from? And I mean, one of the things that certainly distinguishes. Okay, what's the phrase to use? You can't talk about the developed and the developing world. You can't talk about north and south. One thing that differentiates one place from another is the source, where people are coming from. Sometimes it's moving out of the city. In some parts of the world, overwhelmingly, it's rural urban. And the nature of the demand, the sources of that demand, the character of that demand is, again, enormously variable. I keep coming back to this thing about the local variation, but you know, I think it just does bear emphasis because we like to think in some senses we need to think in terms of broad categories, but we need to be very alert to this, you know, local circumstances because I mean real estate is just inherently that way.
Which reminds me, this last point here, talking about speculative development, I also want to share with you that today is the anniversary, or well, I don't know if you call it the anniversary, but the 1 year mark where the untimely death, passing away of Neil Smith happened, who also worked on the land rent gap quite significantly in speculative development. So with this, I want to thank again the speakers, Anne and Richard, for trying to answer what we mean by the question of land. I know there is more to be discussed, and I hope that we will give a partial answer in the book that we're working on collectively also with other authors in this room. I want to thank the speakers and to send you into the coffee break so that you be back on time for the 2 more rounds of sessions that we will have before this fantastic conference is over. And one more time, one person has to thank Sarah for organizing all this. She's really the backbone, and this is the only opportunity that we have collectively to thank her. But before we do this, we also want to thank the speakers. Thank you.